Taxi drivers, have you ever had to follow someone? A similar story. 10 years ago I was in the train station about to leave TE City when I got an urgent phone call to fix one thing on the company's server. So I jumped in a taxi and I directed the driver to drive me exactly under my window to get the Wi-Fi. I pulled up my laptop and connected to server. I had a text mode matrix like Linux and I could see the driver staring into the screen. In my country you can sit in the right place of the taxi driver. When I finished I said, "Now drive me back to train station, quick. I have a train to catch." I only realized what was in the man's head when he said at the end of the trip, "Just for you to know, I have a son that works for Secret Service too." Edit, yes, I had VPN but I still needed a free Wi-Fi from somewhere. Edit 2, don't you guys complain about typos anymore?
Jumping into a taxi to solve a server issue while racing against time is something. It's good you had a VPN, but using public Wi-Fi can be risky. Pretty memorable trip, I'd say.
I'm not a taxi driver, but a police officer. I was moonlighting at a club and a fight broke out inside. The bouncers had an unusually hard time getting this one guy out of the club. I went inside to help and he took a swing at me. He then took off running out of the club down the street. I gave chase, but this guy was fast, I didn't have a chance at catching him. I chased him maybe 2 blocks and saw a taxi sitting in front of this other club. I jumped in the taxi and told the driver to follow him. We caught up with the guy and as we approached him, he was attempting to flag us down. I told the taxi driver to stop for him and as he opened the door there I was, he was too surprised to do anything but stand there. I placed him under arrest and called for another unit to come pick us up.
It's interesting how police work can cross over into unexpected situations like this. Moonlighting at a club definitely adds a different dynamic. The chase part seems intense, but the taxi ride was a smart move. That moment of surprise when he opened the door must have been something. Always a mix of unpredictability in law enforcement.
I got the story firsthand a couple of days ago from the tuk-tuk, rickshaw, driver himself who was asked to follow someone. It all started when someone jumped into the guy's tuk-tuk and asked him to follow another tuk-tuk that was a few kilometers 100 meters ahead. The tuk-tuk driver said that he followed the other tuk-tuk without asking for an explanation and when the tailed tuk-tuk stopped in a fairly secluded place he noticed a middle-aged man step out with a child of 5 or 6. The passenger on our protagonist's tuk-tuk then related the story of his following the other tuk-tuk to him. The passenger, a good Samaritan, was walking in a marketplace a few minutes earlier when he overheard a suspicious conversation that went on between the kid and the guy, involving the kid wanting to go to home because, you, the middle-aged man, wouldn't get me the bicycle. The tuk-tuk driver got off the rickshaw and headed for the guy, who left the boy alone to go for a piss. He then interrogated him with the Good Samaritan, and in the fashion of a true pedophile, the middle-aged man gave an incoherent account of his relationship with the boy and kept stumbling over his own words. It later turned out that the middle-aged man lured the kid out of his hometown with the promise to buy him a bicycle and took him over to a different city altogether to be secluded with him. TLDR, a tuk-tuk driver and his passenger followed a pedophile with a young boy across the city and stopped him before he could do the deed. Edited to change kilometers into meters. Thanks you /PureArcher490. Edit 2, whoa. Just got gilded for the first time ever. Thanks Justice Porn Addict Stranger.
That's a pretty heavy story. The tuk-tuk driver and the passenger did the right thing by following the other tuk-tuk and confronting that guy. It's good to see people stepping up in situations like this. It's a reminder that being aware and acting can really make a difference.
As a taxi driver for 3 years, if anyone told me to do anything dangerous or annoying, like speeding or picking up more passengers than seatbelts, I would usually refuse. Especially if the request came from a drunk promising, "I'll tip you fat, bro." One special occasion, bar-crawling students started piling into my car. I opened up with my routine statement, "I only have 4 seats available." Before I could tell them, too many, a guy no taller than 5 feet stuffed himself into the cab at the foot of his friend already seated at the front. He folded up like a battle droid and his friend simply told me, "He's small, it's okay." I took them to their dorm. Edit, thanks for the upvotes everyone, I don't read it very much. I felt this thread needed a first-hand story. Too many, not a driver but a passenger or an uncle, tales.
That's an interesting situation. You had a clear policy on how many passengers you could take, but sometimes people just don't listen. It's kind of funny how the guys thought it was fine to shove another person in there because he was small. At least you managed to get them where they wanted to go without any trouble. Good call on sticking to your rules, though. People can be unpredictable.
I used to be a cab driver when I was 18. One night I got called to a house in suburbia and a young couple got in the back. They asked me to head to an address about a 15-minute drive away. When we arrived, they didn't get out. They just looked out the window and were trying to look through the window of a house a few doors down. "Is that him?" the woman asked the man. "I think so, I hope so." Then the man sent a text message off his phone and kept looking at this window. All of a sudden we saw someone wave and then disappear. I just kept the car running and waited for instructions. After about 5 minutes the light in this room went off and the couple kind of held each other and were really having an emotional moment. The woman comforted the man by saying, "He's okay." Then they asked me to take them home. On the ride home the man told me his son had been taken away from him by his ex-wife in some bitter dispute. I can't remember the details and I was quite young at the time, but it definitely sounded like this guy had been totally fucked over. He wasn't allowed to see him at all and they went through a lot of trouble just to see his hand wave through the window. The taxi fare was like 95 Australian dollars or something because of all the time. I think I charged them something like $20. Did I help them violate some sort of court order? Probably. I suspect they needed to use a taxi for this reason. I was and am still okay with it. I have opinions on the way fathers are treated in custody disputes.
It shows how complex relationships can get, especially when kids are involved. The couple seemed to be in a tough situation, trying to connect with the kid in any way they could. Your decision to charge less is interesting, considering what they were going through. It's a gray area, but you felt it was the right thing to do.
Not a taxi driver, but this legit happened to me. Driving through my old college town, where I lived and was a student at the time, in my two-door car. I see a girl running in the road, not on the sidewalk, slow down to ask if she is okay and needs help. She opens my door and somehow wiggles her way past my seatbelt into the back seat, hands me a $10 bill, and yells, "Follow that truck." It was a big red truck in front of me. I say okay, she seems happy until we get to a red light, which the truck runs. I say, "I'm not running the light." She says okay, asks me to open my door, and proceeds to run after the truck down the road. The car ride was very quick, we only drove a couple blocks. To this day I have no idea what it was all about.
That's a strange encounter. You stop to help someone, and it turns into a wild ride. Sounds like a scene from a movie. It's interesting how quickly things can escalate. Sometimes, moments like that just happen and leave you confused.
Not a taxi driver, but a similar kind of thing. Many years ago in a different life, I was working as a beat cop in a small city, walking foot patrol. A call came over the radio that there was a big brawl in a pub about 6 blocks from where I was, requesting all units. I stepped into the road and stopped the first car that was passing, leaned inside and said, "I need you to take me to a certain hotel, as quickly as possible." A huge guy in the passenger seat leapt out of the car and yelled at his girlfriend, who was driving, "Honey, out of the car." He jumped into the driving seat, me into the passenger seat, and burned rubber 6 blocks. Girlfriend left behind in the smoke with a bemused expression. I was the first unit to arrive, jumped in, subdued a few participants with the aid of my mystery recruit, and had everything tidied up before the police cars arrived. The big guy left with a dazed expression and the hugest smile I had ever seen on a sober person. Thanks, helpful stranger.
Funny how things can turn out when you least expect it.
This is a story from one of my friends, but I feel it's relevant enough. It goes something like this. Once my friend was about to get in a fight with another fella outside a party, and to prevent the situation from escalating, I quickly put the both of us in a cab and told the driver to get us the hell out of there. A few minutes later we realize we're being followed by the same guys from the party on another taxi, probably thirsty for blood. We tried to communicate the seriousness of our situation to our Indian taxi driver, but he wouldn't say anything in response. At this point, we weren't even sure if he spoke English. So I took $20 out of my pocket, put it on the deck of the car and said, "I'll give you this right now if you run that red light." The driver stared at me for the longest time and grabbed the $20 bill without saying a word. What followed were the most intense 60 seconds of my life, as we ran past over several red lights at blazing speed, performing ridiculously sharp turns like this shit was GTA 5. In the end, we lost the guys chasing us. When we arrived at our destination, we thanked the driver, and he just stared at us as he drove away. I'll never forget that man.
That's quite a story. It's interesting how quickly things can escalate at a party. That driver must have had some serious skills, running those red lights like a video game. It's a weird mix of panic and excitement when you're in a situation like that. And the fact that he didn't say anything just adds to the whole experience. Sometimes you meet people in the craziest circumstances, and they just leave a mark on you.
This happened a few years ago whilst I was at university. I needed to submit a major assignment by 5 p.m. that afternoon or face a serious penalty. Being a terrible procrastinator, I was still writing the thing at 4 o'clock and desperately trying to print it by 4:30. Replacing ink cartridges ate into my travel time, so I frantically ordered a taxi as my usual bus commute would take too long. I jumped in the back with my paper in hand. The journey didn't start well as we hit a major traffic jam. I looked at my watch and saw that it was 4:50. The university campus was a 15-minute drive away. I need to hand in this in by 5 o'clock or I'll fail. I told the driver. Get me there in time, and I'll pay you triple. He didn't respond with words, but it was like activating Jason Statham mode from The Transporter. He instantly veered into the bus lane to our left and slammed on the accelerator. The following ride was like something straight from a getaway movie, screeching through corners, running red lights, driving on the wrong side of the road. We got there by 4:57. Assignment submitted and time-stamped at 4:59, with a minute to spare. Best driver ever. I offered him a beer afterwards, but he declined. True professional.
That's a pretty intense story about last-minute situations. It seems like the driver really pulled through and understood the urgency. It's interesting how random moments can turn into something cinematic. You had just enough time to submit your assignment, which is always a relief. It's cool that he declined the beer. Guess he was just doing his job. Makes you appreciate good drivers when it counts.
Not quite follow that car, but on my first visit to Bangkok, the British guys I were with treated me to my first tuk-tuk ride. There were 4 of us, 2 in each tuk-tuk, when the guy next to me leant forward and said, 500 baht if you beat that tuk-tuk. Apparently the others did the same and the most insane tuk-tuk race through Bangkok ensued. Sometimes on the wrong side of the road, sometimes on the footpath, with pedestrians jumping out of the way. Incredible. We ended up paying them both for the exciting 15-minute ride.
Sounds like a wild experience. Racing tuk-tuks through Bangkok isn't something you'd get to do every day. The mix of adrenaline and chaos must have made it memorable. Definitely a unique way to see the city.
Not a taxi driver, but I do have a story from when I used to run for Favor. Favor is essentially an anything delivered app, but you also do random tasks sometimes. One of the first shifts I worked, I received an order to deliver some cookies for a small bakery owner. When I arrived, they weren't done yet, and I ended up having to wait about 10 minutes till she finished the order up. She finally brought out a massive $100 stack of pizza boxes full of cookies for a birthday party, and told me that they need to be delivered literally all the way across town, at 5 p.m., at least it was Saturday, in the next 20 minutes. Mind you, this is in Austin. Our traffic situation is fucked, and even at a normal time, it'd be a 30-minute drive. She promised me a good tip if I was able to deliver them on time, so I said, sure thing. And hopped in my truck. It was like something out of The Transporter. I know the city pretty well, have a fairly extensive library of back routes stored in my brain, so I was able to line up a low-traffic string of side streets that I flew down at go-to-jail speeds. Totally unnecessary for a delivery of cookies, but hell, it was a fun challenge. I arrived at the house 15 minutes later, knocked on the door, and handed the boxes over to the woman, who didn't even thank me, and slammed the door in my face. Somewhat offended, but still proud of myself, I sent the bakery owner a text saying, "You're all set." She replied, "Awesome, thanks." I grinned and readied myself for a big tip. A notification sounds on my phone. $5.
That sounds like a pretty wild delivery experience. You managed to navigate the Austin traffic like a pro, which is impressive, especially for cookies. At least the bakery owner appreciated your work, even if the tip was lower than expected. You took on the challenge and delivered on time, so that's something.
Not a taxi driver, but when I was in school this happened to me. We were returning home from the school in the school bus just having fun and yelling to people, yeah, stupid kids doing silly stuff, and we dropped a kid in his house. When we were dropping the kid, a friend of mine yelled to a stranger and scared him. He got crazy mad as we were already starting the car when that happened. While leaving I look back and see this guy stopping a cab, pointing at us and telling him, "Follow that school bus." 5 minutes later the cab make us stop and the guy paid and starting yelling at us and stuff.
That sounds like a wild ride home from school. Kids can get a bit carried away, and it seems like this guy took it too seriously. But getting chased down like that by a cab driver is definitely unexpected. Hopefully, you guys learn not to mess with strangers after that.
Not a taxi driver but a passenger. I had just gotten off the bus when I realized my phone wasn't in my pocket. Luckily a cab appeared so I jumped in and shouted, "Follow that bus." I knew the vague route from my stop so we eventually caught up with it, but it turned into a bus interchange stop, no cabs allowed, but it hadn't reached its terminus. I ran out of the cab and jumped onto the bus to search my seat. I completely ignored the fact I just bolted out of a cab without paying and onto a bus without paying the driver. I couldn't find the phone until some passenger said, "I heard a clunk back there." The phone was a few rows behind, so luckily he mentioned it, otherwise I would never have found it. My phone is pretty much always on silent and vibrations of a bus trump an iPhone any day of the week. I got off the bus before he left for the next stop and high-fived the bus driver who figured out what was going on by now. I returned to the cab who was still waiting for me. Took the cab back home and gave him a fat tip. Much cheaper than buying a new phone. It wasn't badass at all but felt it.
The story has a bit of a hectic vibe. Missing your phone, chasing after a bus, and the whole cab situation sounds chaotic. It's cool that you managed to find your phone thanks to that other passenger. The cab driver waiting for you is a nice touch too. In the end, you got your phone back and the cab ride was worth it. Not a bad day overall.
I was the passenger in a similar situation. My then girlfriend was celebrating her birthday on an island just off the coast, and the only way there was using a ferry that we had to get to by train. Her terminally ill mother was already on the island, and it would probably be the last birthday she would be alive. It was. Me and my girlfriend had to work, so we were en route to the last ferry on Friday evening, and our train was horribly delayed. We got off at the next station, and went to the taxis. The ferry was a 2-hour drive, and we had to get there in one. We stepped up to the most badass looking taxi driver and asked him, "We have to get to the ferry in less than 1 hour, and he just smirked and said, "Let's go." He blasted off, bypassing the regular line of taxis over the sidewalk. He got a lot of angry looks from the other taxi drivers in front of him in the queue. Once we got to the highway he was going 200 kilometers per hour with his blinker lights on. In exactly 1 hour we raced onto the parking lot, where they were already closing the ramp onto the ferry. He honked and flashed his lights, when my girlfriend jumped out to get tickets and I paid the guy. We ended up paying $200 for the ride, jumped onto the ramp that was still hanging midair, and made it to the island. Her mother passed away a few months later. Best $200 I've spent.
This sounds intense. The urgency and pressure with the delayed train and needing to reach the ferry in time really adds to the story. That taxi driver did not hold back, which is pretty wild. Sounds like you did what you needed to be there for your girlfriend and her mother. The ending, while sad, emphasizes how important that moment was.